There are no reserved seats in my courtroom. The voice came from the bench with the finality of a door being locked. And it belonged to Judge Philip Calder, who had been sitting in the 12th Judicial Circuit of South Carolina for 19 years, and who had, in the course of those 19 years, developed the particular manner of a man who has confused the power of his position with the authority of his wisdom. He was 54 years old, broad-faced, with the flush of a man who eats well and exercises conviction instead of his body, and he had the robe on and the gavel near his hand and the gallery behind him, and he intended all of it to mean what it had always meant in this room. He had been addressing the bailiff. But everyone in the courtroom understood the address was not for the bailiff. The old man seated in the back row of the gallery did not respond. He did not look up from the hands folded in his lap. He had been directed to the back row by the bailiff 12 minutes ago, when he had come through the courtroom door and moved toward a seat in the third row, one of several that were technically unreserved but had been tacitly held by the positioning of a folded program and a jacket on the adjacent chairs for the alderman family, whose grandson's sentencing was on the docket and who had arrived with enough social mass to make such claims stick. The bailiff had not explained this when he redirected the old man. He had simply put a hand on his elbow and moved him toward the back. The old man had gone without protest. He had chosen an aisle seat in the last row, against the side wall, and he had sat down and folded his hands in his lap and looked at the room with the patient attention of someone who has learned that the room always tells you what you need to know if you give it enough time. His name was Thomas Wick, and he was 79 years old. He wore a gray suit that had been pressed with military exactness, the crease in the trousers sharp enough to draw attention, the jacket smooth across the shoulders, a white shirt beneath it, and a plain dark tie knotted without flair. On his lapel he wore a small enamel pin, not a flag pin, not a service pin, but a small thing the size of a fingernail that the people in this courtroom were not close enough to read and had not asked about. His hair was white, cropped close, and his face had the quality of old maps, full of lines that go somewhere, that record actual territory. His eyes, when he finally raised them to survey the gallery with the same patient deliberateness he brought to everything, were pale blue, the color of high-altitude sky, and they moved across the room the way a surveyor's level moves across terrain, taking measure, finding true, making no record of what they found. He had come to watch the sentencing of a young man from his church whose path he had tried and failed to redirect across 3 years of Sunday mornings and Tuesday evening conversations at the fellowship hall. He had not been asked to speak. He had come because the young man's mother had asked if he would be there, and Thomas Wick, in 79 years, had never told a mother no. Judge Calder had not created the seating situation. But he had noticed it, had noticed the old man in the gray suit being redirected to the back, had noticed the alderman family installed in the third row with their programs and their jackets, had noticed the way the old man had accommodated the move without complaint. And he had decided, in the way that men of certain temperaments decide such things, that the accommodation was correct. That order had been served. He had continued his pre-session review of the docket and had not looked at the back row again. The gallery was full. Beyond the alderman family in the third row were attorneys and clerks and the assorted company of a busy court calendar, families waiting on their own matters, a law school intern in a bad suit, 2 journalists from the local weekly with notebooks open. The room smelled of floor polish and recycled institutional air, and under that the faint residue of old wood and older decisions. The ceiling was high, and the windows were long, and the light came through them in the particular way of October light in South Carolina, angled and warm, making things look more considered than they are. A woman in the second row, a court reporter named Sandra Elms, who had been in this building for 11 years and who noticed everything, had watched the bailiff move the old man to the back. She had watched the old man go. She had watched him sit. She had watched him fold his hands and look at the room. She had been watching him, off and on, for 11 minutes, with the expression of someone working a question she cannot yet solve. She could not have said what it was about him. The suit, pressed to that particular exactness. The hands, large and very still, the knuckles of a man who has spent his life using his hands for things that required them to be certain. The pin on the lapel, the way he looked at the room, not as a citizen looks at a courtroom, with the slight anxiety of unfamiliar authority, but as a man looks at a room he is visiting, comfortable in his own authority, and curious about its arrangements. She leaned sideways to the attorney beside her, a young public defender named Marcus Webb, who was 26 years old and had been in this building for 8 months and still moved through it with the careful attention of someone who has not yet stopped learning how it works. She said quietly, "Do you know who that is?" And she tilted her head toward the back row. Marcus Webb looked. He looked at the old man for a moment. He said, "No. Do you?" She said, "I'm not sure. I think I might." She took out her phone under the bench level, and she searched the name she thought she recognized from the lapel pin, the small enamel pin that from 11 feet she could make out as a unit crest, though she couldn't read the designation. She searched what she could read of it. She searched the gray suit and the bearing and the particular quality of stillness. She searched through a different door, the Circuit Court's public records, a veteran's memorial listing, a newspaper archive from 14 years ago that had run a piece on a ceremony at Fort Jackson. She found him. She looked at the phone. She looked at the back of the courtroom. She looked at Judge Calder on the bench, who was engaged with the clerk about a scheduling matter and was not looking at anyone in the gallery. Marcus Webb watched her face change. He said, "What?" She showed him the phone. He read it. Then he looked at the back row. Then he stood up, not dramatically, not urgently, but with the clean certainty of someone who has decided that something is required of him and is going to do it. He excused himself from the bench in a low voice and walked out of the courtroom through the side door, and in the corridor he made a call. He made it to the Veterans Affairs liaison at the county courthouse, who was a former Army sergeant named Pat Dillard, who kept a desk 2 floors up and who had a Rolodex that was actual and physical and reflected 35 years of relationships with every veterans organization in the state. He told Dillard what he was looking at. He said the name. He said the courtroom number and the judge's name. The silence on Pat Dillard's end was 4 full seconds. Then, "Say that name again," Webb said it. Dillard said, "I'm making a call. Don't let anything happen in that room until I get back to you." His voice carried the tight, directional urgency of a man who knows exactly what he is doing and is moving very fast. He hung up. In an office on the 3rd floor of the federal building 2 blocks east, Brigadier General Ann Castellano, 1 star, Judge Advocate, currently assigned to the 4th Army's legal review team and in Beaufort for a quarterly coordination meeting, was sitting across a conference table from a colonel when her cell phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. She said, "Excuse me." She answered. She listened. She said 2 words, "Which courtroom?" and stood up before the answer finished. The colonel said, "General?" She said, "I'll be back in 20 minutes." She said it without looking at him. She was already moving. She crossed 2 blocks in the October sun and entered the courthouse and was through the security checkpoint and up 2 flights of stairs before the elevator in the lobby had finished considering the request. She did not have her uniform. She was in the gray suit she wore to legal meetings, which was the suit of a woman who has been doing serious work for 30 years and knows what the suit is for. She stopped in the corridor outside courtroom 4 and looked through the narrow window in the door. Thomas Wick was still in the back row. His hands were still folded. His eyes were on the bench, where Judge Calder was reviewing a document with the unhurried confidence of a man in complete possession of his room. He did not look like a man who was waiting to be rescued. He looked like a man who had made his peace with the back row and found it sufficient. And in a way it was, because the back row of this courtroom was not the worst place Thomas Wick had ever been directed to sit. And the worst place had been considerably less comfortable than this, and he had sat in it with the same folded hands and the same pale attention and had come home from it, as he had come home from every other place. The lapel pin had been his object of stillness since the bailiff touched his elbow and redirected him 12 minutes ago. He had not reached for it consciously. His left hand had simply moved under the cover of his folded right and found it the way it always found it. By memory. By the 30 years of the same small gesture in difficult rooms. The pin was a unit crest, the crest of the 3rd Special Forces Group, a small enamel thing worn smooth at the edges where his thumb had moved across it 10,000 times. He had been given it by a man who did not give things lightly, in a place where the giving meant something specific and lasting. The courtroom dissolved. The floor polish smell became the smell of red laterite dust and diesel and the particular equatorial heat of West Africa in August that the body rejects for the first 3 days and then simply incorporates. Because the body will incorporate anything it has to. The long courtroom windows became the open sides of a land cruiser moving at speed down a dirt road that did not appear on any map he had been given, toward a compound that did appear on a satellite photograph he had been shown once and was not permitted to keep. Thomas Wick was 41 years old, and he was in Sierra Leone in 1995, and the man beside him was Master Sergeant Roy Alcott, 38 years old, from Baton Rouge, a man who had a way of sleeping in moving vehicles that Thomas had been attempting to replicate for a decade without success. Alcott was not sleeping now. He was watching the tree line on the left with the focused, impersonal attention of a man scanning for the configuration of shapes and shadows that does not belong to the forest. Thomas was doing the same thing on the right. They had been in country for 11 days on a mission whose parameters had been modified 4 times, which was 2 times more than the parameters of a mission should be modified before the mission itself becomes a different mission that nobody briefed you on. Thomas had said this to the team leader, a young captain named Frawley who was talented and careful and who actually listened when his senior NCO spoke, which was not universal and which Thomas therefore valued. Frawley had said, "I know." Thomas had said, "What do you want to do?" Frawley had said, "I want to finish it and get everyone home." Thomas had said, "All right." That was the whole conversation, because the relevant conversations are almost always short. Roy Alcott had been Thomas's partner for 6 years. He was the person Thomas trusted most in the world in the specific conditions that trust is tested, under fire, under confusion, in the dark, in the gap between the briefing and the situation. He had the quality Thomas valued above all others in an operator. He was exactly the same man in every condition. Not fearless, not reckless, the same. Whatever he was in a briefing room, he was on a compromised vehicle on a dirt road in West Africa, which is rarer than it sounds and more important than it looks. The road curved. The tree line opened into a burned clearing, and Thomas saw the vehicle positioned in it before he could form the thought. He said Roy, and Roy was already moving because Roy had seen it a half-second earlier, as Roy always had. What happened in the next 4 minutes was the compressed violence of close quarters that does not reward description, and that Thomas had replayed approximately once a year for 28 years without it becoming more comprehensible. Roy Alcott took a round in the upper left chest in the 3rd minute. Not fatal. serious. Thomas gave it the attention it required in the 5th minute. In the sudden silence after, while Frawley got on the radio and the driver held compression on a second casualty. Thomas packed Roy's wound with the focused efficiency of a man who has done this before and who has decided he is not going to lose this person, which is not a rational position but which turned out to be correct. Alcott was alive in Baton Rouge, retired 8 years, 3 grandchildren whose photographs he sent Thomas every Christmas with a note that said the same thing. Still here. Thomas kept every note in the drawer of his desk. He read them on the occasional bad night when he needed the reminder of what correct turned out to mean. The pin had been Alcott's. He had pressed it into Thomas's palm in the field hospital in Freetown, his right hand bandaged to the elbow, his color not good, his eyes steady. He had not said anything. He had not needed to. The pin said, "You kept me here." Thomas wore it every day as the only statement he ever intended to make about what he had done and why. The courtroom returned around him quietly, the way it always returned, the floor polish, the long windows, the October light, the bailiff near the door, the alderman family in the 3rd row, Judge Calder on the bench. Thomas Wick was in the back row, with his hands folded and his left thumb resting on the pin, and nothing on his face had changed. General Castellano opened the door. She walked in. She walked down the center aisle. She did not look at the judge. She walked to the back row and she stopped at the aisle seat where Thomas Wick was sitting, and she looked down at him. He looked up at her. "General Castellano," he said. His voice was quiet, and it had nothing in it that was not pleased to see her. "Sergeant Major," she said, and then she straightened, and her right hand came up, and she rendered the sharpest, most precisely executed salute that Sandra Elms, who had been in this building for 11 years and had seen federal judges and state attorneys general and one former president walk through it, had ever witnessed. It was the salute of someone who means it with everything they have, directed at an old man in a gray suit in the back row of a circuit court in Beaufort, South Carolina. The courtroom went very still. Judge Calder had looked up from his document. He was looking at the woman in the gray suit standing at the back of his courtroom with her right hand raised in a military salute. He was looking at the old man in the gray suit who had been directed to that seat by his bailiff. He was beginning to recalculate something that did not finish recalculating quickly. General Castellano held the salute for 3 full seconds. Then she lowered her hand and turned to face the bench. "Your Honor," she said. Her voice carried to the bench without effort, which is the voice of a woman who has addressed courts-martial and congressional subcommittees and hostile negotiating rooms and has never once needed to raise it. "I'm Brigadier General Ann Castellano, 4th Army. With the court's permission, I'd like to introduce the man you seated in the back row." Judge Calder said nothing. This was the first time in 19 years he had nothing to say. Thomas Wick retired from the United States Army as Sergeant Major after 31 years of service. He served in Vietnam, in Grenada, in Panama, in the Gulf War, and in Somalia, 5 wars across 3 decades, in units whose names are not available for public record. She paused. He holds the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, 2 bronze stars with the Valor device, and 4 Purple Hearts. He was the senior enlisted advisor of his brigade for 9 years. He was the kind of soldier that generals call when the thing they are planning needs to actually work, and that they do not discuss afterward in press conferences. She looked at the bench. He came here today because a mother from his church asked him to be present for her son, and he has never in his life failed to be present when he was asked. The courtroom was completely silent. The light came through the long windows at its October angle. Somewhere in the gallery, the alderman family had gone very quiet. Your Honor, General Castellano said, I would ask that Sergeant Major Wick be offered a seat commensurate with his service. Judge Calder looked at the back row. He looked at Thomas Wick, who was sitting with his hands folded and his eyes on the general with an expression of mild, affectionate patience. The expression of a man who did not ask for any of this and is waiting for it to be finished so the court's business can proceed. He looked at the gallery, which was looking back at him with the collective attention of 30 people who have just understood that they are present at a thing. He looked at the bailiff. Then he looked at the courtroom, at the gallery full of people who had sat down this morning expecting an ordinary Tuesday. Something moved across his face that his clerk, who had known him for 11 years, had never seen there before. He set down his gavel. The court will stand, he said. Not just the bailiff, the whole courtroom. And they stood. The attorneys stood. The clerk stood. The journalists stood with their notebooks open. Sandra Elms stood. Marcus Webb, who had come back in through the side door 30 seconds ago and was standing near the wall, stood. The Alderman family stood, every one of them. The grandmother with the arthritis in both knees, rising with the careful dignity of someone who has decided that this is worth it. The law school intern in the bad suit stood so fast his chair scraped. 31 people stood in courtroom 4 of the 12th Judicial Circuit of South Carolina in the October light, for an old man in a gray suit who had come to keep a promise to a mother. Thomas Wick looked at the room. He looked at the people standing. He looked at the general beside him. He looked at the judge on the bench. He nodded once. The small, precise nod of a man who is not unaffected by what is happening, and has no intention of showing how affected he is, which is its own kind of grace. The court is grateful for your service, Sergeant Major, Judge Calder said. Please sit wherever you like. There was a seat in the third row that someone had been saving with a folded program. A program moved. A space opened. Thomas Wick did not take the third row seat. He walked, slowly and without hurry, to the front row of the gallery, the row behind the bar, reserved for families. He sat. He folded his hands. He looked at the bench with the same patient attention he had brought to the back row. The young man whose sentencing was on the docket that morning was led in 20 minutes later. He was 23 years old and frightened and had made 3 bad decisions in a cascade that had brought him here, and when he came through the door from holding and looked out at the gallery for his mother, he found her in the second row. And in the front row, between his mother's sightline and the bench, he saw Thomas Wick. He saw the gray suit. He saw the folded hands. He saw the old man nod, once the same small, precise nod, and something in his posture changed. Not much. Enough, the sentencing proceeded. Judge Calder was not a different man. He was the same man he had always been, operating in the same room with the same authority. But he ran the session that morning with a quality of attention that his clerk would note later, as different from his usual manner, more deliberate, more careful, as though he understood that he was being watched by someone whose judgment he had not previously accounted for, and that the accounting was not finished. Afterward, in the corridor outside the courtroom, General Castellano stood with Thomas Wick, while the building redistributed itself around them. You didn't have to do that, he said. No, she said. I didn't. He looked at her. A faint thing moved in his eyes. Not quite a smile, the thing that lives before one. How did you hear? Pat Dillard called me. She paused. He called 11 people before me. I was the closest. Thomas Wick nodded. He looked down the corridor at the courtroom door, which had closed behind the departing gallery. He's a good young man who made bad decisions, he said. I'd have sat in the back row every day of his sentence to tell him so. I know you would, she said. She held out her hand. He shook it. Then he put on his hat. A plain, dark hat. No insignia. the kind of hat that goes with a gray suit on a Tuesday morning in October, and he walked down the corridor toward the elevator, unhurried, his hands at his sides, carrying everything he was in the particular way he had carried it for 31 years, without announcement, without explanation, simply present in the world and available to those who needed him to be. 6 weeks later, Judge Philip Calder drove to the Veterans Memorial Garden at the edge of town on a Sunday morning. Alone, he had spent 2 hours in the public record. The pieces that were public, which were less than the full record, but enough. He sat on the bench by the reflecting pool and thought about 19 years on the bench and the particular quality of certainty those years can produce in a man, and whether certainty and wisdom are the same thing, and whether they had been the same thing in him. He did not call Thomas Wick. He understood that what he owed could not be paid to the man directly. It would only be condescension in a different register, but could only be paid forward, in the room where he had failed to pay it, to every person who came through that room after. He drove back to town. He did his job. His clerk noticed the difference. She didn't ask about it. She was glad of it. Some of the people who walk among us carry more than their suits can hold, and they never ask you to notice, and they never ask you to stand, and on the days that you do, that is entirely your own. If you were moved by Thomas Wick's story of quiet dignity and the grace he carried into every room, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and be sure to subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes.